Hi everyone, I'm Paras Chopra and today I'm with the Balaji S. Srinivasan. He's an angel investor and an entrepreneur, formerly the CTO of Coinbase and general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. He was also the co-founder at several tech startups. He graduated from Stanford University and holds a PhD in electrical engineering. As the CTO of Coinbase and as an investor in several startups, he's been deeply involved with the crypto ecosystem right from the start. And as a consequence of it, he's developed a deep understanding of broader implications of crypto on our society. And he believes that the time has come for society to fully embrace the implications of crypto. And one such implication is what he believes as crypto states. So, crypto states are these, as I understand, these fully virtual groups of pseudonymous people with decentralized everything, currency, organizations, and identities. And Balaji believes that nation states will evolve towards something like crypto states. And this is a bold idea on the future of nation states, something that we've taken for granted for so long. And that's what I'm going to explore in all its glory today with Balaji. So thank you, Balaji, for making time today for talking to me.
Great to be here.
Fantastic. So I wanted to start with your career trajectory and maybe taking a bit longer arc to what finally got you interested into crypto and how it all evolved.
Sure. So career trajectory. So I think you hit the highlights of my bio. I think after the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of people started thinking about the nature of money, and I was no different because essentially, if you know the concept of a leaky abstraction from computer science, the thing that you thought would just work doesn't anymore, and you have to actually debug at a layer below where you thought about, right? And I hadn't really thought that deeply about money or exactly how money was created. I had heard, Ron Paul, he's an American politician. I'm not sure if your viewers know him, but an American libertarian-ish politician who talked about ending the Fed and so on in the mid 2000s. But I hadn't really got into the details of how the Fed operates or what have you. And the bailouts of 2008 and the quantitative easing that was begun starting in 2008, 2009 got a lot of people interested, including myself. And I started to think more deeply about, okay, what is what is money? What exactly is going on here? Bitcoin actually came out in early 2009, but I got, I'd heard about it when it was on Hacker News and through friends relatively early on. But what really made me believe that it could be something with staying power was its recovery from the 2011 crash. So in 2011, it ran up from $1 all the way up to like $32. And then it crashed all the way back down to $2. And there are various articles talking about the rise and fall of this digital currency, and it was a failure and so on. But then in something very unusual for tech, it came back. And the reason I say it's unusual for tech is there is the concept of the Gartner hype cycle, or Carlota Perez's concept of these sort of investment bubble cycles, which actually goes all the way back to railroads. It's this very common thing. You have this bubble, all of the people flood in, there's investment, overinvestment, huge hype, and then it's overhyped and it crashes down like this. That's a dot-com bubble and so on. And then, what happens is a few companies make it through and they survive. And then actually the future was overhyped in the short term, but in some ways even underhyped in the long term, 10 or 20 years out. And the reason I just say that is you usually see that at the level of a sector or an industry, but often individual companies, with very rare exceptions, like Amazon.com is one of the very rare exceptions that made it all the way through that bubble crash phenomenon. Those are often the hardened competitors, the real survivors. So applying that pattern recognition lens, I was like, okay, something that can come back from a drop to $30 down to $2 from a more than 90% drop, because 90% would be 30 to 3, so more than 90% drop, 30 to 2, and it's coming back. That's got some staying power. Something is interesting there. So I started digging into it more over the course of 2011 and 2012 and got very, very involved with it starting after that. I had a Stanford lecture in late 2012, early 2013. I probably pulled the PDF or something where I said, I'm not sure if Bitcoin is the winner, but it's definitely created something very important. And the reason I say that is I didn't know at the time whether it was Friendster or Facebook, you can't easily tell that, but you can tell that the category has been created. like social networks, like digital currencies were a category. So that was me coming at it with my like kind of tech and I was also interested in the philosophy and other stuff underneath it. So there were a few different angles I was approaching it from. What's interesting about crypto, though, is it's something where different people come at it from different angles, and each sort of boom and bust cycle brings in a new generation. So the very earliest were, let's call them, crypto anarchist, libertarian ideologues, right? Who, I'm actually sympathetic to in some ways, but I would say that I believe in crypto civilization. So I think that many of their critiques actually do make sense, but I don't think that people can survive completely on their own. I do believe in a degree of more like a sovereign collective than a sovereign individual, like more like small tribes than total solitary individuals, if that makes sense. I'll come back to that point. Let's say V1 were ideologues, then V2 were early adopter engineers going into the 2011 to 2013 cycle. And then in 2013 is when venture capital, angel investors really started to get involved. And that was when Coinbase and blockchain.info and so on were funded. And then in the next cycle, it was financiers, which was banks, everybody who was thinking about crypto for the back end of financial systems and so on. These are the blockchain people. Funds got involved, pension funds and so on, actually started to back people in the 2018, 2019 cycle. And now we're seeing artists with NFT art. Also, during this period, you had a growing and very important sort of human rights angle on crypto, which is like, people in Nigeria using Bitcoin when they're denied bank accounts, people in Venezuela using it when the currency is being inflated. And really, these are two halves of the same coin, because what crypto really does is it's property and property rights and speech rights and encryption and civil liberties outside of the control of abusive states. And if your state, by the way, is mostly convincing rather than coercing, then people don't really need to use crypto quite as much. I mean, you can use it for lots of other things. You'd use it for getting around centralized companies, not just states, because the power of a Facebook or a Twitter is also something you can decentralize with crypto, which is very important. So even if you don't buy the state argument at all, the corporate argument is important. But the more abusive a state is, like a Venezuela, the more important crypto is. It's kind of that last bulwark. The check and balance is actually outside the state. All right, let me pause there. That's kind of journey or what have you. Yeah. Get your thoughts.
There's lots to unpack here, and I do want to come to the real benefits of crypto, like some of them you mentioned. But before that, I'm interested in knowing your sort of, as a general sort of thing, your sense-making algorithm. In the sense, when you first came around crypto, it was a strange thing, I think everyone looks at the white paper and admires its beauty, but different people approach understanding it from different points of view. So not just for crypto, I know you have deep thoughts about lots of things, how robotics will change, genomics, and so on and so forth. So I'm interested in knowing how did you make sense of it? I mean, different people make sense making differently. Some people look around, some people think from first principles. How do you go about when you encounter something strange and new?
A combined arms approach. So, I will take various threads. So history, for example, has this idea worked in a different form 200 years ago. Technology is something newly technological feasible. Extrapolation, I have a lot of curves in my head, like sequencing is going like this, and internet adoption is going like this, and online mating is going like this, and video conferencing was going like this, and then it went totally vertical, et cetera. I've got a lot of those kind of curves in my head, like percentage of the economy that's a crypto economy, for example, right? And I have hypotheses about how those curves evolve that I'm always updating. Every new piece of information I sort of matched against whatever 100 curves I've got in my head. And I'm like, okay, that one is going to go faster. Or this is actually, for example, autonomy for cars that's moving slower in some ways from a regulatory standpoint, but the technology also has, you need LiDAR, other kinds of things. It's moving a little bit slower than one might have anticipated 5 years ago. So A, I said history. B was the technological feasibility. C is these curves. D is one of my friend Chris Dixon, a Kinsey partner, calls nerd energy. Right. So like the early adopter.
I love the phrase.
Right, nerd energy. Right. So it's like, are you seeing subreddits that are really interested and engaged in something? Do they have like an energy around it that's similar to their energy around CrossFit, for example, or their energy around other kinds of things like this? Subcultures. Bitcoin was definitely like that. Another aspect that I think is important is sort of like a failing incumbent. Do people hate the incumbent? Is the incumbent only still on top because of their distribution? And this is something, by the way, that took me a very long time to understand as an engineer, which Thiel actually also talks about, the distinction between product versus distribution. And the thing is, product is merit, distribution is connections. And as an engineer, you think, okay, I'll build the best product, I'll solve the equations, and it's just going to be right. I don't need to know somebody or make a deal or something, it's just going to work. But to give you an example, so, just toy examples, a great blog post nobody sees is great product, terrible distribution. Conversely, a terrible article that's in a major newspaper is terrible product, but great distribution, and it applies in lots of other areas. Like if you go into a retail store, most people don't think about this, but why do you see certain kinds of goods? Why is 5-hour energy drink or some energy drink, why is that right near the checkout line? Well, both the store owner and the vendor of those goods knows that those are actually very valuable places to keep inventory, right? And actually, if you've got your goods all the way near the back, it's just like the difference between, accessibility on the street. Near the street is better, typically for foot traffic, and in the back, people need to go and seek it out, right? So those are distribution deals. Like literally having this carousel at the front of the store is something that an energy drink maker might pay $5,000 to the store owner for, right? And most people don't even think about that. They're not thinking about the extent to which distribution deals shape things. And so distribution is about both quantity, the number of people who are plugged into something, and quality, the, for lack of a better term, eliteness or influence of those people, right? So an example of high quantity, low quality might be, a reality TV show's fan base, right? All right, so it's high quantity, low quality, right? The other extreme might be a high energy physics mailing list. That's high quality, low quantity, at least for that particular vertical. And the point about this is when you've got something that's sort of late in its evolution, like Oracle, Oracle Corporation, if you're familiar with them, they have great distribution still, legacy distribution, but a declining product in comparative terms relative to Postgres and the other offerings. Like, any startup that said they were starting on Oracle, I would look at them like this and really wonder why they were doing that, because you'd want to start on Postgres probably, or another open source database, maybe MySQL, though I would say Postgres for the most part, especially because MySQL was bought by them, by Oracle a while back. And didn't lock down the database entirely, but they do exert some annoying points of control over it. And so the point being that when you've got an incumbent which is declining like this, neither quantity, but especially in quality of distribution, you have an opportunity. So, for example, in the West, like the, legacy media has suffered a massive decline in the quality of their product. And now they've lost a lot of quality of distribution, where lots of people in tech just simply don't listen to them anymore, because we know they're direct competitors and so on, and we need to build alternatives. They're literally just competing corporations. And it sets a signal of something which, if you just looked at quantity, you'd say, oh, they still have lots of subscribers, they still have a large user base. And I'm like, yeah, but Mark Andreessen doesn't listen to them anymore, right? Thiel doesn't, 50 other CEOs and VCs and angels and investors that have founded and funded all these billion-dollar companies don't listen to them anymore. And that means they've lost a big chunk of the future. And then you will start to see a new exponential rise. This is similar, by the way, to 2008, when the banks lost the loyalty of a huge chunk of high quality people in the population, and when they lost that loyalty of people, that led to fintech, that led to crypto, because there was enough of a consensus that banks were bad, that there were essentially three waves of quote reform. The first wave was Dodd-Frank, which wasn't really reform. That was in the US. There's probably something similar in India, actually. You might be able to tell me about that. But essentially those Dodd-Frank, all it did was a bill in the US that essentially punished the banks by making them into by giving them more regulatory protections, by having all these regulations, which were things they could pay for, but nobody else could. So it erected a moat, and they stopped all new banking licenses. But there are two other reactions, which were fintech and crypto. And in both of these two lanes, which are going to merge up, a very common point was, yeah, the banks are bad, right? That was a premise, right? And so the high quality people kind of opted out. And when I say high quality, that does not necessarily mean like a rich person at all. It can mean just somebody who's like a penniless 18-year-old, but who's motivated to build a disruptor to the banks, and of which there were quite a few of them. For example, Vitalik being one example, was not like, a wealthy person. All right, let me pause there. So those are like 5 examples of ways that I build these mental models, and some in depth on distribution and the failure of incumbents.
Yeah. So what I captured from this is you take a long view of history on how technology evolves, and then I think I love the last part where the way I captured is some sort of inevitability where there is enough cracks in the establishment that the whole world essentially is rooting for the new and emerging technologies.
That's right.
That's where you feel the click will happen. So
that's exactly right.
Do you feel this? Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was asking, do you feel these cracks are inevitable, that high quality distribution eventually gradually erodes? Is this like an inevitable cycle of technology? Some companies have, they seem to be counterexamples like Amazon. It just keeps on growing and growing. But I'd love to hear your views on it.
Yeah, well, so Bezos just left Amazon. So we will see, like often a founder can manage through these cycles. Something, for example, that is hugely underestimated in terms of how difficult it was, for example, Facebook managing the transition to mobile, or Facebook's bet on Instagram, Facebook's bet on WhatsApp, Facebook's bet on Oculus. Each of those are things like Instagram today, people are like, oh my God, it was such an obvious buy, like Zuck is a monopolist, blah, blah, blah. But at the time, in 2012, when Instagram was absolutely not an obvious decision. It was worth $500 million like a few days before Zuck paid $1 billion. $1 billion was 25% of Facebook's cash on hand. Instagram had 0 revenue. It was weeks before their IPO. The board wasn't consulted, and everybody thought it was just this dispensable thing. And Facebook, why can't they just clone it, et cetera, right? So it was hugely brave for Zuck to make that decision. Everybody thought it was, Jon Stewart at the time, if you guys know Jon Stewart, he's, like a Daily Show guy. He popular in the US. He ran a clip where he said, Instagram, $1 billion for that. The only gram I'd pay $1 billion for is one that instantly gets me a gram. But and so that was like the attitude at that time. And so the thing is that a founder, a good founder, can have enough conviction in that vision of the future, the weakness of the incumbents, the strength of the technology, in their rational argument to essentially jut their jaw out and be like, actually, I'm right, and you'll see. And resist the crowd. Now, that doesn't mean they're always right, but it does mean that if they are, it is not just the intelligence to see the future or the wisdom to understand the past, but it's really the courage to take a non-consensus position in the face of significant short-term costs to money and often reputation. Oh, you look like an idiot. The easy thing to do for Zuck reputationally would have been to not do that, but in the long term, that would have caught up to him. Point being, most companies are not still run by their founders. And it's, Bezos talks about the company bets and so on. Founders don't just have the vision, good founders don't just have the vision to reinvent the company. They also have the moral authority to do that, right? If you think about it, you're saying, hey, we're X as a company. And then you flip it around, you say, actually, everything I told you for the last 5 years is now wrong. We're doing Y, right? Now, a founder can say that because everybody's like, well, you built it from scratch. All right, guess we're doing Y now, But the 180-degree reversal, for example, to go from a desktop app to a mobile app, or just to drill into the Facebook thing for a second, because it doesn't seem like a big deal to us today. From 2021, you're like, oh yeah, of course, Facebook has a mobile app, right? But at that time, Facebook had made a bet on so-called HTML5, which is now actually out in production and so on. But they thought, hey, we can just use web technologies to build web clients for the iOS and Android devices, and it'll be fine. And actually, it turned out to be slow. It turned out to be much less performant relative to native apps of iOS and Android. Later they did do React, which did achieve some of those earlier aims, but they were getting crushed on this strategy. And Zuck basically fired, I don't want to say, fired, let's say, made a change of course where rather than HTML5 decided, let's go native apps. So everything they were just doing, thrown away pretty much and just go in the other direction, And I think only if you have the balls and the authority and the intelligence to do that, all three of which are not usually in the same person, right? There's people who have courage but not intelligence, or intelligence but not courage, or intelligence and courage but lack the authority. They're like 3 levels down the hierarchy, right? Only of all 3 of those can you drive the change required for an organization to not lose quality. Let me pause there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right. I think organizations, a group of people would never take a non-consensus bet. It's just highly unlikely. Right. The more people you add, the less risky bets they tend to take. And I would just draw parallels to 2008 when financial crisis was happening. The Fed and other central banks just took a low risky sort of, the right way probably should have been to let financial sort of consequences take place and probably banks to fail and so on and so forth. So what you're saying is people have this anger on this inefficiency being persisting because there is a group taking decisions which are low risk, and there is an entrepreneur like Vitalik or Satoshi who just are very angry at the inefficiency and want to change the world for the better.
Yeah, I would say, I don't think, I know Vitalik fairly well. I don't think angry would be the right word I'd use there, but let's say dissatisfied with the existing thing and feels that they can build something better. It really comes from a positive place with him. And I think also with Satoshi, they were never angry online, but I understand what you're saying. I would add one edit though, which is I did become interestingly more sympathetic to the bankers and the Fed after being in crypto. And I'll tell you why. So basically, for one of my friends, I had this one-liner with him, which is that crypto makes libertarians more progressive and progressives more libertarian, because it allows you to see, you're actually running the experiment. So you can see the flaws in your worldview, right? So how does that relate here? Well, when you're actually managing a money supply or an economy, for example, what happened with the DAO hack in 2016 in Ethereum was, many of your viewers may not know this, but there was a large contract that had a bug in it and it was hacked and it had a lot of money in it. And it seemed to impede the transition to Ethereum's proof of stake and so on and so forth. There was like this huge thing. And so what happened was Ethereum was still in like the $1 billion phase, it wasn't in the $100 billion phase. So it was still quasi-centralized. So people went and called up the exchanges, said, hey, can you stop trading? And a patch was rushed through that actually froze the funds associated with the DAO attacker's wallet and refunded everybody. So it was something where a patch was pushed into the blockchain, adopted by all miners, that reversed the funds of this giant transaction effectively, which is exactly what people always said blockchain should never do, right? And the thing about that is, like at the time, people didn't believe that was a one-off, but effectively it was. And the thing about it is, it actually reminded me of the founding of America in a particular sense, which is there's the American Revolution against the British, which people know about. What most people don't know about is later within the US, there was something called Shays Rebellion, where a bunch of folks who were American said, hey, just like America rebelled against the British, we're rebelling against this federal government in the US, and they tried to break off and they were put down. Okay. And so essentially the idea was, hey, that American Revolution, that was just a one-off. You can't do it again, And so it turned out that basically Ethereum has never done anything since that 5 years later, and billions of dollars have gone on the platform. And it was one of those things that only good leadership, the only way to know that that was actually the right decision is to look at on net in the fullness of time. Revolutions are judged by their fruits. They're often very messy. Lots of extra legal decisions are made at that time, right? And only in the fullness of time do you see, well, are people coming into that jurisdiction or are they leaving? Are they coming into this blockchain or leaving, right? In the fullness of time, it's clear that was the right decision. At the time, it wasn't. And so the reason I had sympathy for Bernanke is I was like, okay, this is kind of similar to a hypothetical situation to explain in computer science terms where mortgages.wellsfargo.com went down in 2008, and that was going to take atm.wellsfargo.com and student loans.wellsfargo.com and all the other financial instruments they had, take all those down with it, because they had the single monolithic server where all the apps were running on one server, to use a computer science analogy, right? Essentially, the mortgages part of the bank would crash the bank and crash services for lots of other people and crash other banks. And so, the money wouldn't come out of your ATM because they hadn't factored it out properly. The thing couldn't just fall. And why couldn't it fall? Well, because licenses had been hoarded. Why were licenses hoarded? Well, we need to make these banks safe. We can't just let anybody run a bank, right? And of course, it seems logical because, of course, people can lose funds. And it was actually illogical. And the reason is excessive risk intolerance means you're taking on huge risk, because it's like somebody who is like, oh, I don't want to work out, I could get hurt. And they never work out any day, and then they get fat, and they basically or get unhealthy and out of shape, and they suffer health consequences in the future, right? Taking that short-term pain gives you long-term gain. Taking short-term risks averts the long-term certainty, not even a risk, but certainty of a decline. And the analogy here is that with crypto, because everyone's their own bank, yes, people do lose money. There's all kinds of crazy hacks and kinds of things that happen. But on net, what's happened is we built this gigantic ecosystem over the last 10 years because we were able to exit to a realm where you could boost the risk tolerance again. You could allow people to take risks and get rewards. You could exit that physical world where everything had bumper corners on it in such a way as to give the appearance of safety at the expense of long-term innovation. All right, let me pause.
So the financial crisis was precipitated largely by the centralization of banks. So decentralization nature of crypto is, centralization makes things fragile and decentralization is more robust. But there's a trade-off. Centralization also comes with efficiency. And as we've said, we've come to this topic in the podcast, but I was just thinking aloud that there is always a trade-off between centralization and decentralization. With decentralized, just to power decentralized network, you do require some inefficiencies. If you see that as a continuum, and one of the inefficiencies is definitely the power usage and so on. If you compare say fragility of Visa network and the power it consumes versus robustness of the Bitcoin network and the power it consumes, it doesn't seem, to me, it doesn't seem you could do like a net equation. It comes down to preferences. Do you share this view?
Well, so on that comparison, I mentioned this like several years ago, but Bitcoin and more generally crypto is not best compared to Visa, but to the U.S. military and the police and the Brinks trucks and the entire security apparatus that creates the dollar, that safeguards property rights in the U.S. Right? If you think about how do I enforce a court order in the U.S.? You get police to come to your house. You have the judiciary, right? You have courts. You have a huge percentage of the economy, all the lawyers and all the heating and food and lighting and so on for the lawyers. You have the police, as I mentioned. You have the military. You have the aircraft carriers with the petrodollar backing the dollar that way. You have this enormous security establishment that is what safeguards property rights and backs the dollar. And that is what Bitcoin mining is. Right? What Bitcoin mining is it's the security budget for a world where property is guarded not by more weapons, but by more math. And so it's more quantifiable and visible. You can see it, but it's just totally different from Visa, which is riding behind that entire security blanket, which is very expensive in not just energy terms, but certainly in life terms. And if you compare like how many people have been blown up in the Middle East, how much conflict has arisen when you have to defend property with weapons as opposed to cryptography, I think you get a very different equation out from it. So that's the most important categorical high level difference.
Okay. So we'll come to this question. I did want to sort of talk about benefits, the demonstrated benefits of crypto. So a lot that is talked about is the benefits projected. If everything sort of evolves and falls into the place, there'll be a lot of benefits. But what has crypto done for the society so far? And I'm not asking as a skeptic. I'm genuinely curious.
It's a great question. So I'd say crypto right now is very useful, immediately useful for two large classes of users who are the power users and the marginalized. Okay. So what does a power user want to do? That's like a developer or a financier. They want to do things like send $10 to 1,000 people in 100 different countries and have them do something and get a receipt back in 10 minutes, or send $2 million to this address in 5 minutes, right? That's a power user of money. That's someone who's hitting a key and like large amounts of money is flowing around the world and doing things. For example, someone who's writing payments for Airbnb, or somebody who is like a hedge fund manager who's moving into and out of positions on behalf of their clients, which could be pensions or other large funds. Those kinds of people, crypto solves a lot of their problems because it's a more powerful engine for moving money around the world in many ways, as I'll come to. And the second large group are the marginalized. These are people who lack bank accounts, or the unbanked, but they're also the unbankable, people who are unpopular and they just lost bank accounts. They are the deplatformed, and they're even machines, right? Like that's to say, just like a device doesn't have a telephone number but has an IP address, a device doesn't have a bank account but can have a crypto address. So a machine can now make money. It can receive payments, right? So in different ways, these groups are outside of the banking system, and they're pushing the banking system from two different directions. The power users are pushing it to do more. The marginalized are pushing to even just get on board and get a bank account in the first place. And some entities, like let's say Binance, are kind of both at the same time, where they're absolutely a power user. Binance is like this, international crypto exchange. I respect CZ, by the way. They're Coinbase's major competitor, but they're very smart and they've executed well. So much props to them. Binance is certainly a power user of money. They've written a crypto exchange. A lot of their stuff happens on chain. They're also, in a sense, marginalized because they're sort of this international entity where they're sort of driven out of China. They're kind of this, I shouldn't say a stateless actor, but they have to be sort of agile. They're more nomadic for sure than something that has a stable home base, right? So in that sense, they're marginalized. And so you could be both at the same time on different axes, right? And the reason I say this is important is, often when people think about a payment, the first payment that comes to mind for many people, especially in the US, is your daily coffee payment, with Starbucks or whatever. And the reason that's misleading is that is to crypto roughly what phone calls were to the internet, right? What I mean by that is crypto is good for payments that are very large, very small, very fast, very automated, very international, and or very transparent. Whereas the credit card payment to your like coffee shop barista is none of those. It's not very large or very small. It's like, I don't know, $5 or $10, whatever. It doesn't have to be very fast because it's happening over the course of 30 seconds or whatever. It doesn't have to be very automated. There's two humans in the loop. It doesn't have to be super transparent. You don't need everybody else to see that transaction, and it's certainly not very international because you and the barista are right across. So crypto solves none of the problems associated with the coffee transaction. That is a problem that's well solved by the existing financial system. By analogy, think about phone calls. Before the internet, you could pick up the phone and call somebody. And there were a lot of people in the early days of the internet who are focused on VoIP, right? Voice over IP. Yeah. And that was an obvious application of the internet, just like television was an obvious application of the internet because it existed before the internet. The less obvious applications were things like search engines and social networks, which had they had analogs beforehand. You had the card catalog at the library, you had the flip book, but no one would have thought that those would have gotten so big on the internet. They're billions of times bigger on the internet than they were offline. There's probably billions of, Google searches that happen every day versus, how many trips to the library to go to the card catalog. The billions of photo albums are looked at every day versus how many times you open up the photo album back in the 80s, So it wasn't television and telephone that were put online immediately. It was mail. Mail was put online, right? But it didn't map exactly. The applications of information that were popular pre-internet were not that wasn't the order in which they went online. YouTube happened after Google, right? VoIP and Skype happened after Google and Yahoo and a bunch of other companies. Yeah. So in the same way, the kinds of things that crypto is good for, as I mentioned, what the power users, the financiers, developers. So let me give some more concrete applications. Okay. So fundraising. Brave, 5 years ago, was able to raise $35 million from people in like 70 countries around the world. And the money settled within seconds And then they were able to, or minutes, and they were able to just go and spend it. Okay. Now, if you tried that with a normal bank account, do you know what happens?
It would take several days, weeks.
It takes several days. B, a bunch of people's accounts would get frozen, right? You'd have to probably go down in person. They'd say, how are you getting $1,000 from a guy in Nigeria, 50,000 from somebody in Japan, 100,000 from someone in Portugal, $2 million from some rando in Mexico or India that you've never met? This is so weird. Like the banks, every fraud alarm would target, all the funds would get frozen. You'd have to spend weeks, maybe months explaining how you got millions of dollars like this. It would just not happen. Plus the amounts that were sent would be varying in such dramatic quantities. It'd be $100 from this guy and $3 million from a guy in another country, right? And the analog of that is we don't really perceive this that much, but when you get on Hacker News or you get on Reddit or Twitter, it's actually very international. It's English speaking, but if you were to see the flags or the geographies of everybody who logged onto the site, you don't usually see that, right? You don't see their flags. And if you did, you'd be like, whoa, this is a meetup of like 400 people from like 30 different countries. It's way different than what it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's far more international. And that's totally transparent because all the communications happen back and forth internationally. And that's what crypto does. It just levels it out. So all the transactions happen internationally. You don't care if someone's in the same country or not. By analogy, again, to the internet, like if you think about the difference between mailing somebody something, right? Physically mailing, you need their physical address. India's format for an address is different from America's, is different from Singapore's, is different from Russia's. There are all these different address formats. And, there's folks who just spend tons of time on just this. Like it's literally like a mini company just normalizing address formats around the world. Someone's zip code, some this, some that. If you've ever implemented these forms, they get complicated. An email address is a single regex that works anywhere in the world, right? alpha@beta.com, right? Okay. Similarly with payments, how do you pay somebody? Well, wire transfer instructions differ from every country. And if you want to do a Japan to Brazil payment or Japan to India, maybe the banker's never done that particular connection or that particular route. And so there's all this, overhead, and it takes days, and there's a high wire transfer fee, and it's slow, and it can be held because you never received from that country. And in crypto, it's a single address, just like an email address. You paste it in, they hit send, you're on the phone with them, you can see it settle on chain, done, right? It is literally the difference between a snail mail and an email in terms of speed, right? 2 to 3 days versus basically, minutes or seconds, okay? And the thing is, I can go through many other areas where the fundamental primitive, so that's like the speed of wire transfers, right? So it's 10x on wire transfers. It's a 10x on gold, so like $10 million of Bitcoin is more than 10x lighter and easier to handle than gold. It's a 10x on crowdfunding. If you look at what crowdfunding was before crypto, the largest online crowdfunding was like Star Citizen, I think, which was like in the tens of millions. And crypto's destroyed that. EOS was like $4 billion, right? So it's like a 100x improvement from 2015 to 2017. That's a huge jump. And you can go down the list, right? In terms of the number of simultaneous entities on cap tables. A capitalization table is who owns shares of a stock. So there's a few hundred people who can be on a cap table in the US before it goes public, whereas you can have tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people that hold a token. It's not the same as equity, but it aligns like equity in terms of shared economic interest. And in terms of accounting, one thing many people don't know, I mentioned this in my first post, that if you look at the big four accountants, they actually go and use the Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchains as a gold standard of truth when auditing a company that sends and receives Bitcoin and Ethereum transactions. Why do they do that? Because even if the company has an error in its database, the blockchain doesn't have an error. Yeah. Right? That's completely new. You never used to be able to go and audit, PayPal and Stripe and all these other companies and have something that was in common between them that was in a defined format. So this is what people call not double entry bookkeeping, but triple entry bookkeeping. And there's this article from Deloitte, which I linked in my first post on the topic, why India should buy Bitcoin, that goes through this. And if you talk to the accountants, they're like, yeah, the smart ones realize this can automate huge amounts of financial compliance, right? You can actually show that a payment happened at this time to this person. It was initiated by this person with this digital signature. It was received by this other person who was moved to this other account. All of that forensic accounting now just becomes asserts rather than people digging into it. And so, just in that quick paragraph, just to recap. So 10x improvements in wire transfer, speed, amounts, internationality, 10x improvements in gold in terms of portability, 10x improvements in crowdfunding in terms of quantity, 10x improvements in terms of accounting, and you can go at 10x improvements in terms of number of people on a cap table. You start stacking them up. I could probably list, a half a dozen more or a dozen more. And I didn't mention programmability, right? Programmability, basically, with something like DeFi, you can take a loan and you can take the output of it and pipe it into something that's doing a derivative, and take that and pipe it into an NFT or what have you, okay? And or a DEX. And that's something where it's composable. You could, of course, go and sign 5 contracts with 5 different people and do some Excel sheets which say, okay, the proceeds from this loan are going to be invested in this real estate project. Of course, you could do that before offline, but you need different lawyers. You need a real estate lawyer, and you need a mortgage lawyer, and you need this lawyer, and you need that lawyer. And it would all be done in Excel, and it would all be done offline. And the contract and the legal contract, the Word document and the Excel sheet and the PowerPoint describing it would all be out of sync in different ways. And there'd be a lot of people scattered, and no one could really explain how the whole system works. And it certainly wasn't being enforced by one court or one jurisdiction. All of that now becomes 3 smart contracts, F of G of H of X online, right? Or on chain. And so the thing is that the primitives of the financial system, just purely as an engineer, this is a back-end improvement in the same way and to the same extent that the internet was a back-end improvement on transmitting and publishing media. This is that level of back-end improvement in terms of transmitting and publishing scarce assets. So let me pause there.
I want to build on this analogy. So cryptocurrencies, they push the use cases of money, what's possible. They completely sort of make it 10x better than the traditional use of money that we know, going to Starbucks and buying a coffee. So they push the use cases of money. But I wanted to sort of think about this a little bit critically in terms of the potential of internet. Internet became mainstream. Early on, internet from 1994 to 2004, how it evolved and the sort of benefits it created for the society. And internet was a general purpose technology. It wasn't just used for telephone calls. And within 10 years or 12 years, it did seem to create a ton of value for the society. So cryptocurrency, it's been about 10, 12 years since they arrived on the scene, and they're limited, like you said, the sort of application are limited to currencies and money for now. So how do you see this parallel? Is crypto similarly a general purpose technology, and has it shown the evidence in last 12 years of creating a similar kind of impact on society as internet did?
Yeah, so I would somewhat disagree with your timeline comparison there, but then let me also answer your main point, right? So, but on your timeline comparison, the internet actually started in the very late 60s, early 70s. What you're talking about is the commercial use of the internet, which was the NSF acceptable use policy was only changed in 1991 to permit the commercial use of the internet. And everybody said, oh, there's going to be spam and porn and malware if you allow this. The internet is only made for academia. It's only made for the military, or it's a trusted network. If you allow all these randos on, it'll screw it all up. And you know what? There was spam and porn and malware. They were right. But there's also Google, and now the internet is synonymous with .com, right?
So let me clarify why I put 1994. I'm
you're saying the graphical web, web browser.
The browser.
Yeah, sure.
That is internet for most people.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is you can, it's a question is Bitcoin more similar to ARPANET, where you set the clock back, or is it more similar to something else? What are the analogies? I would say where we are roughly by analogy is we're roughly the year 2000 by analogy. Why? With the internet, remember that the internet was actually most useful early on for tech and media people. It was not useful for business people that much, other than people who are sending lots of emails. Okay. It was, and a lot of people still use physical mail for a long time. Email did not dominate everything for a while. We can look at the graphs of exactly when it flipped over and totally controlled everything. But I was getting physical mail well into the late 90s, even as an early adopter or what have you. And so the folks who were early adopters were tech and media. tech because they could understand the programming, and media because they started putting newspapers and information online. But you couldn't do Google Docs in the browser. You couldn't do Google Slides. All the SaaS applications you couldn't do. You didn't have cloud. You didn't have mobile, so you didn't use it on the go. You had to go and sit at the computer at your desk to go and use it. It wasn't something where every government agency had a website. It wasn't something where government agencies even accepted. Only recently, for example, are court appearances even allowed to be done over Zoom. That's like a 2021 thing. Many government agencies didn't accept it. It wasn't something where people had lots of digital cameras, so they couldn't get information into the internet. It wasn't something where people even knew how to use computers, so there had to have like a generational cycling. The reason I say all this is in the year 2000, Yahoo existed, and it was a multi-billion-dollar company. You had the infrastructure being built and overbuilt in some ways because you had the dot-com crash. You had lots of entrepreneurs who were right about the potential of the internet, but there were so many technical issues to solve over the next 20 years that, Webvan famously crashed, and it took 15 years before Instacart worked, So you had the early billionaires and the early big companies, you had the infrastructure, and everybody had heard of it. But the total number of internet users globally in the year 2000, I think, was only about 40 or 50 million. I forget the exact number, but it was on that number, right? It was definitely not billions. It wasn't. It increased 100x only with the advent of mobile and other types of stuff. Furthermore, after the crash, lots of attention went away from it because then 9/11 happened in the U.S. There was the Iraq War, and in 2002, 2003, 2004, living in the U.S. You use the internet. I use the internet to surf the web, and certainly in academia, I used it. And it was probably an early digital kind of person, but it wasn't something where there were lots of tech companies making money either, right? Google's IPO in 2004 shocked everybody because everybody had thought eyeballs don't make money, and the reason they thought that is eyeballs were just equivalent of putting up a banner ad on the highway, that just shows undifferentiated, the same ad to everybody. So sheer eyeballs were not converting. So people thought internet advertising didn't work. That was responsible for this huge crash. You got 1 million eyeballs, but you couldn't turn into something. Google innovated by copying Overture's concept of personalized ads, doing something uniquely on the internet they couldn't do offline. And that's how they showed how insanely profitable they were in 2004, which shocked everybody. Because basically just to recalibrate, by the way, go and search this query, okay? Google's toughest search is making money. And look at the year that came out.
Okay.
But maybe you can put that online for your guys, right?
I will.
So Google's toughest search is making money. And what year is that? I think that's 2002, right? In the New York Times. Okay. Google's toughest search is making money. And they just thought Google's toughest search is for a business model. Okay. Saul Hansel, April 8th, 2002. All right. There's also articles around that time, Amazon.bomb. Later in 2013, there's a guy, even in 2013, by the way, someone had an article saying Facebook will never make a significant profit. So Wall Street Journal columnist. Okay. And the reason I bring this stuff up is, in retrospect, it's a smooth glide to the top, but at the time, Google's toughest searches for a business model in 2002, by the way, they were making tons of money at the time. Yeah. Nobody understood how big they were or were going to be. What's my point? Even past 2004, much of the US was just obsessed with the war in Iraq and all this other stuff. Facebook and the Web 2.0 era was seen as pastel colors. And there's a video that became popular in 2006-ish called Here Comes Another Bubble, right? To the tune of Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, okay? Here comes another bubble, right? And so people were very, they thought that the acquisition of Flickr by Yahoo for 35 million was this huge show of excess, right? That the acquisition of MySpace for 565 million, that was this massive amount of money at the time, eye-gouging amounts of money. I can't believe that they paid that much money for this thing. Or Facebook at $15 billion valuation. Now, that was definitely ahead of progress in 2007, but Microsoft putting in that money, everybody thought this thing was just another bubble that was going to crash, right? And to be clear, other than Google, nobody on the internet was really making all that much money until 2008. Certainly not by Microsoft standards. And you talk to the Microsoft executives and they were ignoring it all the way up until 2008. It simply wasn't that economically significant. Then what happened were a bunch of things happened at the same time. 2009, the iPhone came out, right? I think it was actually 2008 or 2009. When was it announced? Let's see, iPhone.
I think it was 2009. Seven. I think it was 7.
Yeah. Okay. So it was announced January 2007, and it was released in June 2007. Okay. The App Store came out, I think, in 2008. Okay. So the modern era is actually much less old than we think. These modern conventions are very new. Actually, it's sort of like living through the early 1900s, and all this stuff comes online, like sewage and water and electricity and indoor plumbing, and you kind of just take it for granted very quickly. But it was just invented a few years ago. And you're like, how could I ever done without this? The thing about the iPhone and the combination of the iPhone, the financial crisis, that meant that Apple, Google, and Facebook just started going vertical from the period of 2009 to 2012. And at the same time, media collapsed, with media revenue, advertising revenue, dropping from about 67 billion to like 25 billion or 20 billion. And there's this famous graph on this, which let me see if I can find it, the print media disruption. All right, so this graph illustrates a lot of points. First, look at 2010 and look at how small Facebook's revenue was then.
Yeah.
Right? Google was basically the only game in town for a long time. Uber, Airbnb, all the tech giants, all the concept of valuations and so on, everything you're seeing now is just something that's pretty new. It's less than 10 years old. Okay. And so it seems like it's been around for a long time, because the nature of an exponential is when it works, it's just suddenly ubiquitous and everybody's using it all the time. And so your brain gets rewired. It's a little bit like Twitter, right? What happened on Twitter in July of 2019?
July of 2019?
Yeah.
What happened?
Exactly. Who knows, right? The point is, Twitter is it's like the Men in Black instrument where it flashes in your eyes and you forget what happened yesterday.
That's
right?
true. Yes.
It's because there's this flood of new information, and just the way our brains are oriented is just like, it just like wipes the buffer, and you kind of forget the past in many ways, right? It distorts our perception of time. So the thing about this graphic, by the way, it shows a few things. First, look at how low Facebook's revenue was even going into 2010. Second, look how rapid the collapse of traditional media was. It only started in 2008, 2009 after the financial crisis. Third, Google was basically the only game in town for a while. Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Google, Microsoft. Microsoft's comeback also only happened in the 2010s. So it was basically Microsoft and Google for a while. And then all these new guys like Stripe and what have you, they're all the 2010s phenomena. So that's why the reason I bring this up is I would contest the idea that the internet was just working right away. It really is something where, like, mobile only happened about 10 years ago. Like ride sharing and SaaS and so on only happened over the course of this decade. The ubiquitous use of Twitter for politics is like 5 years old, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of these things are actually, they feel like they've been around for a while, but they haven't. And so that exponential, a lot of things only arrived in the last 5 to 10 years. So let me pause there, and then I'll come back to crypto. Do you agree with the thrust of my point there?
No, I agree. The data, the graph clearly shows if we project ourselves back in 2010, we may be having similar reservations about how far internet can go.
Yes.
But I do want to build on this point.
Because I just want to say one thing about that. There's, for example, a whole series of books on this exact topic. There's, just to give you a sense of the time. Okay, in 2004, Harvard University Press published "IT Doesn't Matter." Okay, IT doesn't matter by Nicholas Carr. Okay, why IT doesn't matter, meaning information technology is no longer a competitive advantage. It's all been commoditized out. This thing was overhyped. Right, blah, 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 And essentially what he said was software doesn't differentiate companies anymore. Everyone's adopted it. You could not be more wrong about the next 20 years. But this was like the Received Wisdom, Harvard Business Review, all these East Coasters, whereas the opposite was Andreessen's philosophy, software is eating the world, which was actually a software engine is going to disrupt every industry. And we haven't even gotten started yet. And no, it's not the case that simply because someone is, by the way, even the word IT is something of a tell. If you have a company that has an IT department as opposed to an engineering department, that company with the IT department is going to get killed by the company with the engineering department, at least in the US. IT may have a different connotation in India. It's got probably a higher reputation in India, but in the US, the IT department connotes, it's like computer technicians who are just fixing the mice or gears or whatever, as opposed to engineering, which is writing code and actually building product, But coming now to the substance of your point, which was, what results has crypto delivered in its first 10 years, right? So, one thing about the emergence of social media and a lot of internet stuff is they had lots of users, but they weren't making money for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Crypto has the opposite emergence mode where nobody disputes how much money is being made. What they're asking is, where are the users?
Right.
Okay.
So let me ask a clarifying question.
Of course.
You said nobody's debating how much money is being made. Is money being made or is money being transferred from one hand to another?
Great question. So when you smooth transfer, you are creating wealth. That's to say, when you reduce friction, that is more valuable to people. When you make a transaction easier, and people will do more of it. As an example, search at Google versus search at a library is much easier. If you can send a transaction in seconds as opposed to days, people will do more of it, and more mutually beneficial transactions will happen. So, one of the issues here is you're asking what societal value has been derived out of it, because we can see the markups of all of these technologies on coinmarketcap.com or DeFi Pulse. But isn't it all just financial manipulation? Isn't it all just zero sum redistribution? Where's the material, consequences in the real world, right? Okay, let me name some. First is breakthroughs in computer science. So Byzantine generals problem, the solution there, the solution to a number of problems in cryptography, distributed systems, adversarial, consensus, and so on. This is accelerated cryptography. If you look at zero knowledge proofs, if you look at ZK rollups, the same thing that happened to machine learning, where every stats professor and every person who's good at probability in some department got pulled out to do data science and ML, and right, the same thing is happening in cryptography and distributed computing departments, where all these professors that languished in obscurity, now their theses are actually worth money because there's emphasis on this. A very important sub area here is actually a critical one called formal verification. I'm not sure if your listeners know what this is, but it's the idea that you can actually prove that a computer program does what you say it's going to do. Historically, formal verification had been the sort of holy grail, ideal, platonic ideal of what a computer program test should be, because you can formally verify it. But it was too hard to actually do until you got smart contracts that handled millions and millions of dollars, and they were actually relatively short in length. Suddenly, formal verification became both feasible and extremely useful. So there's a company I funded called Certora out of Israel that does formal verification for smart contracts. And it's using actually some, like the simplest way of thinking about it is every variable in a program, you're essentially permuting it. And you're saying, can I make the length of this? Can I try and do a buffer overflow? Can I somehow mess up the algebra of this computer program by placing in values or states that it doesn't know, and find an error and then fix that? And so this is a hugely important area if you want to design rockets, you want to design real-time systems of any kind, like the system that runs a self-driving car. Formal verification is a really, really valuable thing. And we finally found business models that fund cryptography, decentralized systems, formal verification, et cetera. So simply from the knowledge standpoint, in basic computer science research, for all these academics that weren't getting funded before, that right there is like advancement of knowledge. Even if it's like intangible, I can point to hundreds of papers on that. Okay, so let me call that number one. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look at Dawn Song of Berkeley, Gun Sire of Cornell, Professor Dan Bonet of Stanford, the professors from the Technion who did Starkware, et cetera. There are lots of professors, not all. There's certainly some who still hate crypto, don't get me wrong, but lots of them are there. Okay. Number two is crypto has given us a framework for conducting macroeconomic experiments that are ethical. Okay, so microeconomics is, the theory of the firm and the theory of individual decisions. You can actually do experiments. You can vary pricing, and you can see empirical supply and demand curves. You can test your hypotheses. If you have a theory about what org chart works or whatever, you can try that and you'll see if your company fails or succeeds, right? It's at least triable on a human timescale. With macroeconomics, a lot of it is frankly voodoo, because until virtual economies and virtual currencies, you couldn't just clone 100 million people and run the experiment. To the extent we know something is true in macroeconomics, we know that communism doesn't work and capitalism does, because you can compare North Korea versus South Korea, East Germany versus West Germany, Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan versus China. You take ethnically similar populations with the same language, you separate them, and one system runs communism, one system runs capitalism, and you get like the famous satellite photo of North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is just blacked out and dark, and South Korea's got lights, right? That's the extent to which you know things are true in macro. But in physics, for example, you don't have right and left wing physics. There's no political dispute over it. It sounds ludicrous to say that, right? But in economics, you have Hayek and you have Krugman. You have, Milton Friedman, and you have, Paul Stiglitz or whatever. You have right and left wing economists winning Nobel Prizes. So that means there's like a very fundamental disagreement over it, where there's like camps and tribes in a way that you just don't have, not in the same way in physics. It's not a political dispute. It's like, maybe you think this particle exists or not, but that's not a political dispute in the same way, right? You don't have tribes of people behind you backing one side or the other. Okay. So the second big thing that crypto has given us is the ability to actually do experimental macroeconomics, not just microeconomics. If you have a theory on monetary policy, on inflation or on deflation, right? On whether helicopter money is good or bad, whether stimulus works, you can found a currency. And if you get people to adopt it, they are all opting in to your management of that monetary system. Now, there's this quote which is something like, "Give me, I don't care who has the guns, just give me access to the currency, I'll control the world." Right? That is an apocryphal quote, right? There's various versions of that kind of quote. Another is, practical men who believe themselves totally devoid of intellectual influence are often the slaves of some dead economist, right? That thing that's Keynes, So economics, the allocation of resources in the economy, how much time do people spend arguing about that every day, right? And if you can come up with a system where you can actually run experiments, we can get out of the phlogiston theory of economics into an empirical theory. And, just to give you a sense, earlier in the conversation, I said crypto makes libertarians more progressive and progressives more libertarian. Well, to give you one example of that, progressives learned that, hey, actually a gold-like thing that can't be printed, that's got cryptographic guarantees on it, is actually super valuable, and lots of people get behind it. But what libertarians learned is, well, you can print all these tokens, and if you build a community behind it, you can magic money out of nothing. So there's some truth to the progressive worldview as well, right? And you can, so that's really fascinating, where if you have people who are smart, and they've kind of come into political camps, sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's because one guy has the tail of the elephant and one guy has the trunk of the elephant, and their observations are not incorrect, but they just haven't lined them all up versus each other. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Another example here, when you're talking about doing empirical economics, is if you set up a crypto exchange, you'll find, people want decentralized digital currency without the state. The idea that the state has to create money, no, that's not true. The libertarian argument is correct. On the other hand, you will find that if you don't have some form of identity verification or anti-fraud, of which you can develop new kinds, I'll come to that. But if you don't have something like that, you will quickly get defrauded. And so the progressive view, you understand why, because you end up rebuilding some of those things. Okay, now I know why they do identity verification, why they're always asking for my papers and my documents, why all this bureaucracy exists. Because if you don't do that, there are scam artists out there who will relieve you of your money, right? So what happens is people who come into this who are straight ideologues just hit reality, and that's super valuable in my view, that you can run experiments on the thing that governs billions and billions of people's livelihoods. You can actually start proving it out. Okay, so call that number 2, knowledge experiments in economics. Okay, number 3, as I mentioned, 10x improvements on the back end of moving money around. And I gave this analogy on Twitter a day or two ago, but imagine that when I clicked send in Gmail, and I sent you a Gmail, right? That behind the scenes, Google printed it out, put it on horseback, okay, took it overseas, put that horse on a shipping container or whatever, sent it over to India. He disembarks, cloppity clop, it comes up to your doorstep, and then they scan it in, and now you can view it in Gmail, right? That is actually a pretty good analogy for the relationship between fintech and the legacy financial system. Right? You click this fancy looking button in PayPal or Square or whatever and send, and the other guy gets it. But what's happening under the hood is a super slow settlement process. Now, actually, the analogy is a pretty good one, because if you imagine that I was sending you water bottles, okay? When I hit send over here, like a physical shipment, in theory, somebody over here could take the risk of holding inventory of water bottles and just give you one, and then take mine and put it in their inventory over there. Water bottles would be fungible, right? If I sent a physical mail, that has a sequence of characters that's unique. So you wouldn't just be able to replace my mail with somebody else's. But if you have a water bottle, the same water bottle, basically you can deliver on the other side. This is very analogous to what fintech companies do. When I hit send, they take on financial risk often, and they essentially extend me credit, and they settle in from my bank account, and they give you the money, and it seems to be instant in your account, but it's because they're taking credit risk in the middle. Okay. This was very apparent during the whole Robinhood scenario, where millions of people tried to use these fancy new fintech things to go and buy stocks at the same time, and that abstraction broke down. It'd be like, okay, now we need 1 million ponies to go and send across the ocean, and who's going to buy all those ponies, and who's going to provide for them? It just choked the channel. The abstraction didn't work anymore. And that would go away in the crypto world, because the backend gets upgraded too. You don't just have this old school wire transfer system, you have instant settlement, you have pseudonymous settlement. Fourth thing that crypto has done is so just to recap so far, right? 1, computer science. 2, macroeconomics. 3, improvements in the financial system. 4, decentralization of wealth creation outside the United States to the rest of the world. So you don't need to be an angel investor in Silicon Valley or a rich guy on Wall Street to be part of crypto. You could be anywhere in the world and buy into it. You could be in Nigeria, you could be in Brazil, you could be in Japan. There's crypto exchanges everywhere. So if you believe in global equality of opportunity, which I do, this was the greatest, we will look at this as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, redistribution of wealth in human history. Okay. Because it's this massive dilution down of anybody who believes in the US dollar or the East Coast or the Federal Reserve, anybody who buys into those illusions, and a massive boost up to everybody who is contrarian and correct, betting early and hard against the system. I mean, in a real sense, this is creating like a freedom class around the world of people who bet against the system, but not on woo, right? Not on mysticism or nonsense, right? They bet against the system, but they were right. So say they're a deviation that's an upward deviation as opposed to a downward. Most of the time when people say, oh, the consensus is good, they'll point to some person who thinks the moon landing was faked, or some crazy person on the internet, right? It's easy to punch down, right? But the real issue is, or the real solution is, there's people on the internet who are smarter than the consensus, who have better ideas than the consensus. And now those people actually, these dysfunctional systems, the same systems that caused the financial crisis and the Iraq war, that have mismanaged, the pandemic, that have caused this political polarization in the US, those are just having resources drained away from them, totally non-violently, to people around the world who made the right bet at the right time. It's this massive decentralization of power, non-violently, economically, away from an institution that no longer deserves that power, that's no longer a steward of the world, right? So that's, I think, a very important ethical benefit, especially as, you just see just more bombings, more bailouts, more printing, more coercion, more riots, more shootings, more polarization, et cetera, as is happening, and especially the pandemic mismanagement. So that's 4 so far. Okay, I can keep going, but you start to see how we're thinking about it. A lot of these things, by the way, what you aren't seeing, and I think this is the part where you might be getting at, right? What you aren't seeing is what's not as tangible to users is backend improvements. But I'll give you another analogy. Linux. Okay. How many of your viewers, you're a viewer or listener, you're listening to this, ask yourself how many times you use Linux a day. Okay.
Yeah.
And my answer is actually surprising, which is they probably use Linux every single day, multiple times a day, if they're in India, because they're using an Android phone, which is based on Linux, and they're running Google queries, and they're using Amazon.com, and they're using Facebook, which are all based on Linux, and or they're using Mac OS X, which is based on BSD, which is based on Unix, so it's spiritually related. And in fact, probably everything they're doing on the internet, there's Windows, of course, there's Mac OS X, but a very big chunk of it is Linux based in some form or the other. So they're using it without realizing they're using it.
Yeah.
When people say, what's the year of Linux on the desktop? Well, it happened. The desktop was just a mobile desktop and it was called Android, right? So crypto absolutely is winning, already winning, will win as a back-end technology. Any power user of money, it's just, crypto is just better for certain things. I prefer wire transfers and stable coins as a professional investor. I prefer writing programs to transfer. I prefer that somebody gave me their Ethereum address to transfer them money in an app, for example, just like you give an email address to log into a site. All of those things are just easier to work with as a power user. So the back-end story, I think, is there. Then the question is, what's the front-end story? How do you make it tangible on the front end? Well, the first thing is, you needed the last decade, speculation was installation. You needed lots of people to value this thing psychologically. You needed the human psychological installation as much as you needed the computational installation in order to build this financial network. And you need the back end to work, right? When you have that, the big unlock that is coming, I think, is scalability, where with ZK rollups and other kinds of things, you can do a lot more on-chain transactions. When that happens, with something like Cairo, for example, with Starkware, I know I'm getting pretty technical now, but there's a number of scalability improvements that are complementary to each other. They're similar to the transition from 28K 57.6 modems to eventually 4G LTE, right? That happened over time. You got faster and faster connections, and things that were a dream in the year 2000, like download a megabyte of JavaScript to go and build a rich web app, are routine. We do that all the time, even on mobile connections now, right? So as on-chain capacity increases, you're going to see that we can use blockchains not just for sending $1 million, once a month to someone in Nigeria as an investment, but you can use it for sending a cent to somebody just by clicking in an app. Just like when you and you can upvote someone and send a little bit of status or information, you can, boom, send a tiny little bit of currency to them. And that's going to be extremely common, but you needed the installation, the backend steps for that user tangible flow of currency to happen. All right, Let me pause there.
Yeah, so I have several sort of threads to unpack, but since we don't have a lot of time, I'll just make some comments and you could pick whichever one you want to address, if at all. One is, I was curious, when we compare it to internet, there have been several similar sort of things which have been sort of presumed to change the world, but they've never done that. Say, for example, MOOCs. I mean, they've not been a complete letdown, but say, for example, massively online courses, they were sort of they were seen to change the world, I think 10 years back. And similarly, electric vehicles in early 1990s. And there have been several things. So there's a hindsight bias when we compare it to internet. So how do you view that? Comparing crypto to something that has worked versus comparing crypto to something which was thought to have a lot of potential, but that didn't pan out. And second, I think it is true, crypto definitely has value. Like you've said, there's no denying in new knowledge discovery, pushing off payment use cases, and so on. But when we see the valuations in crypto, how much of it is driven by the actual value, both in today and in future, versus speculation? And the third thread, and there's a lot of threads, but I was just thinking.
Can I jump on those two while it's still fresh in my head?
Okay. Yes.
So let me do the second one first. So when a venture capitalist puts in 100 million at $1 billion valuation, they have some probability the company gets to 3 billion, right? And there's some probability it goes to 0. So it is, there's a speculation of possible long-term outcomes, right? And right now the crypto economy is about $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Okay, in total. And the reason I actually think that it's going to be 100 trillion by 2030 or 2035 is the economy is going digital. And so, all work is remote work, right? How much, for example, what percentage of your life do you spend looking at a screen?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost entire waking hour.
Entire waking hour. Yeah. Well, so that's the thing. Most of your life is being spent in the matrix. And so you can think of there being sort of 3 forms of something. There's like the physical form, let's say a piece of paper. Then there's the scanner that puts that online. And then there's the text file, which is born digital and it's natively digital, right? If you take education, you have like the college, right? Then you have the scanner, which is like Coursera or what have you. And then you have the V3, which is happening now. And I think you're going to see like the next generation, sort of what like Uber was to Zipcar, right? Zipcar is like a V1 and Uber is like a V2, yeah? Or what the iPhone was to the Palm Pilot, right? The Palm Pilot was like pretty popular, but then the iPhone was like 100x more popular. The Palm Pilot was not a failure, but the iPhone was just much, much bigger and it built on the success of the previous one. The reason the reason that valuation of $1 trillion I think is reasonable is virtual reality is coming and augmented reality is coming and everybody's remote all the time and remote work means international work and international work means offline currencies just aren't as valuable as something where you can use it like email. Like sending money should be like sending an email. You shouldn't have to go to the bank and do a wire transfer. You shouldn't have to look up 50 different formats. It should just be native. I mentioned this in the context of India Stack. Someone said, why don't we just use the national digital rupee? And eventually I was able to come up with a one-liner on it, which is smartphones just let you place domestic calls, they let you place international ones as well, right? And so absolutely, look, India Stack is phenomenal. I'm a huge fan of it. Like we should put a national digital rupee in there. And there's lots of trading that can happen within India on it. But you're also going to want people to be able to as transparently make international transactions, just like on WhatsApp. Do you keep track of who is in India versus outside of India? No, it just works.
Yeah.
Right. And there's all kinds of routing behind the scenes. It's hitting, like it's pinging off of Tbilisi to get to London or whatever. You're not seeing any of that. And crypto will be like that. You'll just be able to get funded by, when you go viral, you just get a lot of likes, you get a lot of money, right? Okay, so the answer to your second point is, this is speculation that the digital economy will become 10x or 100x larger and will need digitally native things. I mean, just if you visualize, by the way, imagine you're in a virtual reality, and this is not that crazy now because VR exists, right? People are using it. All the kids are on Fortnite. When you're in a VR game or environment, and there's the gamification of work, V2, where you're not just using a nice 2D interface, but a nice 3D interface, right? And I've tweeted out some of the stuff like for bioinformatics or anything that's requiring data visualization, VR is better. It's just better. Like you can rotate in 3D, you can have tons of whiteboards there, you can save persistent rooms, you can use spatial memory so that you don't have to remember everything, like where did I put this window? It's like you've got a gigantic mansion that you can like bookmark your stuff in. That alone is quite useful, right? And in that kind of environment, of course, we're going to need virtual currency. So virtual reality may turn out to beat a virtual currency what the iPhone was to the internet.
Okay. Like
that huge boost, right? Okay, so that's number two. These are the reasons that investors who have made lots of money are betting hard on crypto. Of course, it could go to zero. There's ways it could go to zero. There could be, a break of various encryption algorithms. Quantum cryptography could break it. There may be nation-state attacks we haven't contemplated. Of course, there's always risk, right? But I think the idea of cryptocurrency, rather than any specific cryptocurrency, will persist and will improve for these reasons. Okay. Now, remind me of your first point. You said comparing it to past things, there's things that have failed and things that have succeeded, right?
Yeah.
So I think that the analogy of the internet to crypto, I think, is stronger than most other such analogies. And the reason is that the internet took all these forms of media, like books and music and movies, like television, movies, and telephony, and digitized them, right? So you had AT&T, the telephone company, and that became VoIP. And you had the US Postal Service, which was physical mail, and that became email. And you had NBC, which was television, and that became YouTube. And these different forms of information all just got turned into packets. And now we don't think of them as being regulated in different ways, because before in the 80s, mail and television and telephony were all regulated totally differently. And now, of course, you can just send packets, and it'd be really weird if you need a different license for Gmail versus YouTube or whatever. That's actually considered silly, right? By analogy, we have different categories for cash, currency, stocks, bonds, mortgages, art, et cetera, all these scarce assets today. The fundamental innovation of the blockchain was the ability to represent scarcity digitally. Because before blockchains, you could transfer, or rather you could copy rather than transfer something, right? I can copy a file to your hard drive. What I couldn't do is transfer it in such a way that you knew I no longer had possession of it. And everybody knew I no longer had possession, right? So provable transfer is the problem blockchain solves. It models scarcity on chain. You can see there's a debit here and a credit here. It is the debit that was the critical innovation. So before then, you need to trust a PayPal or some central institution, a bank, to make that debit for you. And of course, if you trusted them, they could not just debit you, they could credit themselves. Okay, what's my point? Point is, the analogy to the internet is actually deep because the stocks, bonds, currencies, et cetera, just like movies, music, and et cetera were digitized by the internet, stocks, bonds, currencies, cash, gold, all digitized by blockchains and made programmable, right? So that's why it's like a deep analogy to the internet, not similarly like growth rates, but it's a digital technology that digitizes many previously disparate offline concepts, makes them all programmable, makes them much more valuable in the process. Now, to the meat of your question, which is, how do we know that this is not just a repeat of something that's happened before or what have you? I mean, there's been 4 or 5 crypto bubbles or like booms and busts. It's, as I said, it's been pretty, it just hasn't died. Lots of people have proclaimed it dead. There's a site called Bitcoin Obituaries. Yeah, but where basically they're like, yeah, well, Bitcoin died in 2017, pronounced it by this guy, right? And you're seeing less and less of that now, right? There's less people who say it's dead because it just popped up so many times. It keeps getting more valuable. It has a cycle to it, just like the Olympics have a 4-year cycle. Just like the seasons have a 1-year cycle, there's a cycle to it because the mining does drive it. There's a cycle of over and under investment, of crash and recovery. That's absolutely real. And that matters if you're running a cash flow business where you need to husband cash for the bad times. But that is different than saying it's a bubble, right? Cycle is not the same as bubble. In terms of other analogies you mentioned, I mean, lots of things are things where, for example, AI, people started working on that in the 60s, I think, maybe even earlier, with like Shardloo and whatnot. With video games, that's been going on since the 70s with Atari. Electric vehicles, people, as you mentioned, have been thinking about that for a long time. VR for a long time. It's one of those things where it's just, I mean, that's why technology investing is hard. It's hard to tell whether this is the time it's going to go vertical versus not. That said, at $1 trillion and 100 million users and multiple billion-dollar companies and so on, I don't think this one is a flash in the pan. I think you could have said that correctly where people were talking about digital currency in the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s, but I don't think so anymore.
It seems, every piece of technology that's hyped up eventually actually ends up changing the world in a significant way. It's just the timing that is usually sort of on and off by multiple decades.
Sometimes, exactly. That's right. And the thing is, too early is the same as being wrong sometimes, right? But you can also get scar tissue, right? Where you've seen it fail before. And because you've seen it fail before, you don't invest in it again. And now actually it works. Right. For a while, Peter Thiel said, no one will ever be able to do something like PayPal again. Okay. And why did he say that? Is because it was such a scarring experience for him to set up. I mean, because I thought of PayPal early on as the easiest company in the world. What are you doing? You just got a database that's debiting this guy and crediting that guy, right? And the reason it was hard is there's all kinds of fraud and people using fake credit cards and government criminals and criminals coming after them, people trying to sue them, blah, 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 blah. It was insane, stressful, difficult business, right? They were burning so much cash. There's a dot-com crash. So many things were happening at the same time. And so because of that, he had like a PTSD about him in the mid 2000s or early 2000s, early 2010s. He's like, no one will ever be able to do that again. But he was wrong because he had sort of put such a dent in the world that it had loosened it up. And because of PayPal, you got Stripe and you got Square and you got all these other fintechs and so on and so forth, right? It's like somebody who, hands you the mayo jar and they couldn't open it. Thiel did open the mayo jar, of course. PayPal's like $100 billion company or whatever last I checked. But like they kind of like, I can't open this mayo jar. They give it to you and you can just turn off you can unscrew it because they loosened it, right? They put in the work. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, It's always hard to tell when that explosion is going to come because so much of this is exponential. Actually, a few years ago with Oculus, after it got acquired by Facebook, somebody said something like that in an article. They said, virtual reality follows the path of a few other breakout technologies. They move along in fits and starts until one day they suddenly totally work. And what's interesting was that was written in 2014, right after Oculus had gotten acquired by Facebook. And certainly that was a huge step up for the industry. That was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. People started actually using VR and so on. And then there was a VR winter, and now there's another VR spring where Oculus and Oculus Quest 2 and so on are trending up. And if you use the Quest 2, it's actually phenomenally good. Yeah. Mozilla Hubs is very good. A lot of good stuff is happening in VR. And so it's just this thing where you have to have enough confidence to and balance sheet to wade through the down cycles and not just lose interest.
So in technology investing, being eventually right is equivalent to being wrong if you don't get the timing right.
What's interesting is with crypto, anybody who's early has done reasonably well. If you just bought and didn't sell, which is hard, by the way, if you bought and didn't sell, if you had the right long-term thesis, you weren't too early, and it's kind of funny. It was kind of a one-liner, but like the only thing you need to do to build wealth by 2020 was believe in crypto. And the only thing you need to do to lose all your wealth by 2030 is to believe in the dollar.
So I wanted to get to the main topic, which is the crypto states. So what are they, and why do you believe nation states will evolve towards them?
Great question. So I call these our network states. You can think of it as generalizing the concepts behind cryptocurrencies to crypto cities and crypto countries. And the fundamental idea is, well, first, if you think about what a cryptocurrency is, first, what's a national currency, right? Why does the Swiss franc or the lira have value? It's because you have a group of millions of people in a geographical region that decide to issue a currency, and people around the world treat it as having value, right? Yeah. But what if you have millions of people in a social network? If millions of people can issue a currency, if they can do a digital currency, just like if they're in a physical location, they can do a fiat currency. What we could do is build a social network with a built-in cryptocurrency and a sense of national consciousness, and think of that as a proto-network state. Essentially a group of people that meet online that are just much more serious about purpose. Think about the difference between Bitcoin versus PayPal. People were just users of PayPal, but they were committed to Bitcoin. That's a huge difference, right? Psychologically. And part of that is because with Bitcoin, they had ownership, right? They had a piece of it locally on their computer. So in the same way, what you could do is you could effectively, quote, securitize a city and take like the territory of the city and let's say the city's real estate was worth $1 billion, right? And do you know what a REIT is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real estate trust, right?
Real estate investment trust, right? So imagine you take a square piece of land, right? And let's say that's worth X dollars, and you have a REIT that owns that entire land, and it chops it up into 1 million pieces, and every citizen of the 1 million citizens is given a share of the REIT. Why is that so interesting? Well, the citizen doesn't own the land under which they're sitting. Instead, they have a share in the health of the entire city. And that actually aligns interests to stop NIMBYism. Yeah. Indeed, you have an interest in even having your house. Maybe you might say, okay, move my house from here to there and let them build this gigantic skyscraper, because the value of my shares in the REIT go up. I'm now aligned economically with the rest of the city, rather than playing this zero-sum game where I have to have the inconvenience of having my house like moved or moved out of the neighborhood. Actually, it's being made up to me economically because it's like selling my house for 3x more. I'm doing something that aligns interests. I'm not saying that's the only way of doing this, but that's like a concept that you could use to get around some of the NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. And that's just like one piece. There's actually I've got a whole book on how we would go about this. But essentially, if the story of the last decade, and of course of this decade, but if the story of the last decade was cryptocurrencies, I think the story of this decade will be startup cities, and of the next decade, network states. So the 2020s, startup cities, and the 2030s, network states. And starting a new city is totally feasible. It's not illegal. You can do it. There's in every country around the world, there's ways to take almost every country, maybe not North Korea, but in most countries around the world, many countries around the world at least, I'm not sure if it's technically greater than 50%, but in many countries around the world, there's a process for taking unincorporated land and turning it into a town. Right? Okay. It's not illegal to do that. You can turn settlements into towns. You can hire a police force and you can set it all up. Simply doing that, right, and doing a V2 town, lots of things are regulated at the local level. You could have self-driving cars work there. right?
Yeah.
Self-driving cars can be legal. You could have drone delivery be legal. You could have robotics for everything. There's a lot of things you can do at the local level that you don't need federal licensure for. Just being able to do a V2 city, for example, you make it walkable, right? There are guys in Arizona doing this. I'm an investor in one of these startup cities there. You can have it be something where like it's built around fitness, so everybody's fit. You can ban all carbs at the perimeter, right? So everybody's just keto diet, for example, right? You could have it be a vegan city or a CrossFit city. You could have it built around a language so people can learn, Chinese or Hindi or Tamil or what have you, right? There's a lot of things you can do if you could just start a community from scratch. And people are becoming, especially post-vaccine, much more mobile. So the post-vaccine age, I think, is going to unlock mobility because people don't like lockdown for all kinds of reasons. And now they prize mobility and exit more because it was taken away from them for so long. And they've built all these online communities, and then I think they'll go and meet in person.
Right. It seems the COVID pandemic just suddenly made all this much more feasible. I mean,
Yep.
it just seems things lined up. Of course, COVID was so bad for so many reasons, but this ecosystem got a huge boost.
Yeah, COVID, obviously, it's killed millions of people worldwide. It is one of those things where the adaptation to it hopefully has made us stronger against future pandemics because people know how to go online and so on. But that's only true for some places. I think democratic Asia overall became stronger as a function of COVID, in the sense that that's India on the periphery of democratic Asia, but it's like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and also Australasia, like Australia, New Zealand. They did fine overall. The US was just revealed to be in many ways a paper tiger, where it had all these plans, like the military had these plans for national biodefense in 2018. There's a national biodefense strategy the US military published in 2018 against man-made and natural threats that was worth nothing. It did nothing, right? And so it was something where basically what COVID did is the entire pre-2020 narrative about the developing world and the developed world, that's totally over. Right. The entire premise was there's the developed world, which is the US, and it's even the term developed means it's finished, it's done, end of history, it's done, right? And there's developing world where everybody's catching up to them. And now I think a much better concept is the ascending world and the declining world.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's clear if you're in the US or like the US is just declining in many different respects, and India is ascending, and the global South, so to speak, is ascending. All these people are getting smartphones around the world. And COVID, the biggest, there's lots of long-term implications, but one of the biggest is the remotification of all work. And all these people online in the global South means lots of jobs can be done from anywhere. So lots of people will move from, cold countries with high cost of living to warm countries with low cost of living. There'll be a global migration. There'll be people moving towards, rural areas where there's lower costs and more community. There'll be people, basically this enormous rebalancing of power away from the East Coast of the United States in particular, and of sort of the 20th century in general towards kind of these up and comers. I think that's what's going to be happening as a function of remote.
Yeah, and that's a bet. The crypto bet is really bet on this massive transformation once in a lifetime that we'll have in our ecosystem. Okay, right. Thank you, Balaji. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And
thank you.
Even though I had so many more topics to touch, but perhaps we'll follow up this conversation sometime in future.
Awesome. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Pras. Okay.